Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second breakout session of the BU Wheelock Forum. We'll be taking a deep dive into the conditions that influence teacher readiness and success in supporting two specific populations of students who need and deserve the highest quality and highly supported educators, English learners and students with disabilities. So my name is Ariel Tichnor-Wagner. I'm a faculty member at BU Wheelock in the Educational Leadership and Policy Studies Department, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be moderating this session this morning. And I'm also incredibly grateful for everyone who's taking the time this morning to engage in this really important conversation around research that challenges existing policies that shape teaching and learning conditions as it pertains to educators who serve English learners and who serve students with disabilities, who are essentially every educator. So how this session will be shaped is we'll begin with 3 lightning talks by my esteemed BU Wheelock colleagues. Marcus Winters, he'll be discussing a statewide professional development initiative supporting English learners. He'll be followed by Liz Bettini, who will be discussing disparities in access to qualified and supported special educators. And finally, Nate Jones on the effects of co-teaching on students with and without disabilities. And this will be followed by a 15-minute discussion with Lindsay Jones, the CEO of CAST, and Cynthia Paris, the superintendent of Lawrence Public Schools. And at the end of the session, we'll have time for a brief Q&A. So I really encourage everyone to post any comments and questions you have in the Q&A so we can all engage in this really important conversation. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Marcus Winters. Marcus Winters is an associate professor at BU Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. He's also the faculty director of the BU Wheelock Educational Policy Center. His research focuses on educational policy with an emphasis on school choice, accountability, and policies that shape and impact teacher quality. So without further ado, Marcus, take it away.
Great. Thanks very much, Ariel. Thanks everyone for being here today. I'm excited to talk about this paper. So as you said, we're looking at this question, we call this professional development at scale. We're measuring the effect of obtaining an SEI endorsement under Massachusetts' RETELL initiative. Excuse me. Sorry about that. So the question we're looking at here is, so professional development has really grown, is really important, and there's a lot of it that's targeted now towards English learners to solve this particular problem. So most English learners in the United States receive instruction from a core academic teacher within a general education setting. But we also know that nationwide, most teachers, general education teachers in these classrooms, have received little to no training in how to instruct ELs. And because in order to solve this problem, training associated with preparing general education teachers to instruct ELs, right, to give their training in order to instruct these students in their classroom, has become a particularly prevalent form of professional development. So some form of requirement is now, and the requirements differ substantially across states, but some form of requirement for such training now exists in 24 states across the US. And this is really important because, again, most of these students are receiving instruction in classrooms with teachers that haven't been directly taught how to instruct them. But it also raises a problem when we think about the professional development necessary here. Just the scale of this issue is really huge. So given that more than half of public school teachers instruct at least one L, the scale of training required in order to address this problem is really, really daunting. Which is why we were really interested in evaluating the RETELL initiative in Massachusetts. So Massachusetts adopted, it's called the Rethinking Equity in Teaching of English Language Learners, so RETELL, in response to pressure from the US Department of Justice. And then there's a long story that goes along with it. But essentially what came about from this was this requirement to really increase the amount of training that their current in-service teachers had across the state in order to instruct ELs. So RETELL required that all core academic teachers who instruct even one L obtain an endorsement in sheltered English immersion. And this was by June of 2016. So it was a short period. So in effect, so more than 35,000 in-service teachers across the state completed the semester-long course within a 5-year period. And it's worth noting here that this was not a small ask or a small amount of professional development. This was the course is equivalent to a college level course that goes across a college semester. So this was a large investment in time and a large investment in training. It wasn't kind of a weekend professional development. And the state funded this required professional development during each teacher's district's 2 to 3 cohort periods. So the state split the districts into different groups when they became eligible in order to receive the training. And eligible teachers who did not complete their training were unable to advance, renew, or extend their license. And in fact, one of my co-authors on this paper, who was previously a teacher in Massachusetts, received a letter while we were working on this project saying that he was no longer going to be able to renew his license because he hasn't completed RETELL. And he was no longer a teacher in the classroom, but it was something within our environment as researchers that showed that this did have bite as far as the policy was concerned. So what we're doing in the study is we're estimating the causal effect of a teacher obtaining an SEI endorsement under RETELL on the test scores of the English learners and other students that they instruct. So we actually look for these spillovers for other students to see if the training having completing the training for specifically targeted to improving education for Ls, maybe that had impacts on other students in the classroom. So in the paper we separately measure the effect on students who are currently Ls, students who were both currently Ls or were previously Ls. We look at them as a separate group. We also look at the larger group of never English learners, students who were never classified as an L in our data, and also the impact on students with disabilities. We use a long panel of data with student and teacher administrative records in Massachusetts. Along with records from the SEI endorsement course. So for each teacher, we knew when they became eligible for the training and when they completed the training as well. And we take advantage of that in order to estimate the effects here. So without getting into the details, essentially, our method is leveraging cross-teacher variation in the timing of when they receive the endorsement. So essentially, you can think of our results as asking, of our procedures asking, so on average, does a teacher's contribution to their students' test score gains increase after they've completed the training relative to before? So there's lots of findings in the paper, lots of figures and lots of tables. So I'm just going to give you the brief summary in this lightning version of the talk. Essentially what we find is that when we look at the state on average, so teachers on average, obtaining an SEI endorsement had no significant effect on a teacher's contribution to test scores of Ls that they instruct on average. So this is for the average teacher instructing average Ls across the state. That said, that overall average null or zero effect does seem to mask some positive effects within that overall average. So first, we do find some small positive spillover impacts for students with disabilities and also for non-Ls. This is important because there was some reason to suspect that we might see some spillover from this type of training, but it is some evidence that there was something going on for the teachers that we can see within the data, even though we don't see it for the impact on Ls that they're instructing. We also, and this I think was a really interesting finding that is worth kind of further consideration, is that we find some evidence that obtaining this endorsement increased the effectiveness, did have a significant improvement for effectiveness of the teachers who were hired recently by the district. So this is an imperfect proxy for the teacher's level of experience. And that we saw this effect for these newly hired teachers, both for Ls and for other students that they instruct. And some of the findings were not very small, like they were meaningful improvements for this group of teachers. It's just when we looked at teachers overall on average, we don't see a significant. So it's worth pointing out here before thinking through the implications of the results, pointing out some limitations here. So one important limitation here is we're only analyzing one aspect of RETELL. RETELL was a big initiative that had lots of things going in it other than the SEI endorsement requirement. We're focused on the SEI endorsement requirement here. The other limitations here is that we really should keep in mind that we're observing whether teachers completed the training. We're not observing whether they actually changed their practices. And this is important because we should think of our results as the effect of completing a required training in this area, which is not the same as the effect of actually using the techniques that were taught in this training. We also, we don't observe variation in the quality of training across the state, right? So one limitation here could be that the state had to train a lot of teachers fairly quickly, and maybe that proposed challenges that limited its effectiveness. And also it's worth noting that we only measure the effect on student test scores in the short run, and looking at the long run outcomes are interesting. I will note here though, but the second and third limitations here, they are definitely limitations that need to be taken into consideration when we are interpreting our findings. From a policy perspective though, I still think that they're very important, right? So I think we do have definite interest in knowing the real effect of, for example, of actually using the practices that were taught in the training. But from a policy perspective, it's really important to know, and it's an important part of the impact of the policy, how teachers were actually using the training when they moved it on. So that overall effect of the impact of completing the training different from the effect of actually using those practices, I would argue it still has real important policy implications. So the policy implications of our results. So I think, so our results suggest caution for the use of broad professional development requirements, such as SCI endorsement, and perhaps in other areas, at least as they are applied on a very large scale. That said, we do find benefits for subgroups of teachers, and this suggests that widespread PD can have positive impacts. But policymakers might want to consider first piloting training on a representative group of teachers, for example, and then expanding the training to those who benefit, rather than having this such a universal mandate where some positive effects for some teachers is not showing up within an average of other teachers who weren't impacted by the training. And finally, so our findings that benefits from the training were limited to recently hired teachers, it at least suggests the possibility that it could be more efficient to embed these desired techniques within pre-service training. So, which is something that Massachusetts, it should be pointed out, did as part of RETELL as well. So, to the extent that the training within the SEI endorsement is important and useful for novice teachers, we might see those benefits over time as it's part of pre-service. So, with that, thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to Ariel.
Great. Thank you so much, Marcus, for sharing that important research that raises some really interesting questions around professional development at scale, and kind of the variation you found in some of these effects raises questions around what is it about the trainings that make it more or less effective for educators who are recently hired, right, who've been working in the district for a longer period of time. So now we're going to turn our attention over to teaching and working conditions of our teachers of students with disabilities and special education teachers. So it's with my pleasure that I'm going to now introduce Liz Bettini. She is an assistant professor in the special education program at BU Wheelock. She previously taught students with emotional and behavioral disorders in self-contained and inclusive settings in Arizona and Connecticut. Her research examines factors shaping the special education teacher workforce, and I'm delighted to have her share some of those findings with us now. So take it away, Liz, whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be with you all today. I am presenting work today that I conducted with Tuan Nguyen from Kansas State, Ali Gilmore from Temple University, and Chris Redding from the University of Florida. We examined disparities in access to well-qualified, well-supported special education teachers across schools over time. So just as some context for this work, you know, we heard yesterday a lot about concerns about rising attrition rates in the state overall. And one of the things that really struck me in some of those graphs is that we're kind of, I think we're all kind of rightly concerned about attrition right now, and somewhat perhaps panicking about attrition right now. But attrition is not a new crisis in many schools. And we saw that in some of the graphs that Dr. Chi and Dr. Bakker Hicks shared yesterday. In high poverty urban schools, attrition has been high for a very long time and has been at a crisis state for a very long time. And the same is true in special education. We have had persistent high attrition rates throughout the history of special education. Just as one example, this is a graph from one of Roddy Theobald and colleagues' recent studies with the Washington State teacher data set. What we see here is the years that folks have been in the workforce from 0 to 6, and then the proportion of folks who entered in year 1 who are still there. The black line is general educators. So we see, concerning rates of attrition among general educators with more than 40% out of the workforce by the time they get to year 6. But with special educators, the gray line, we see a much higher rate with about 60% out of the workforce, out of the special education teacher workforce in Washington State by the end of year 6. So attrition has long been a problem in special education, and it has especially been a problem in higher poverty schools. And we have prior research to suggest that that is closely related to the fact that there tend to be less supportive working conditions for teachers in higher poverty schools. So in this study, we really honed in on working conditions as a primary concern. And when I'm talking about working conditions, I'm talking about two things: the demands that are placed on teachers, so the things we ask them to do, and then the resources that are provided to them. So kind of hearkening back to some of the discussions that folks had yesterday around thinking more carefully about teachers' resources. So what resources do we give them to meet those demands? And there's a pretty robust body of research and organizational studies that suggest that the demands and resources the demands we place on folks and the resources we provide them need to be balanced with one another, that the resources need to match the demands and need to be adequate to the demands so that folks can fulfill those demands within the time pressures of their workday. And there's also a pretty robust body of qualitative research with special educators to understand, what are the key demands that these teachers are experiencing and what are the resources that they're relying on. And what we find in those studies is that the major demands are the things we ask them to teach. So how many lessons are we asking them to teach? How many grade levels? What are the characteristics of the students who they're serving? And then other responsibilities such as bus duty, lunch duty, paperwork is a big one for special educators that has lots of implications. And then the resources that they rely on include social resources, such as support from administrators, from colleagues, from paraprofessional staff, logistical resources, which are kind of the practical tools required to get the job done, such as curricular materials, planning time with kids. And in addition to those resources that are provided by the school, teachers also bring internal resources. So they bring knowledge, skills, competencies, and the working conditions in their school can enhance those internal resources, for example, through professional development, coaching, mentoring, and so on. All right, so many of us in this call were teachers and probably can remember lots of times as teachers when your demands and your resources were perhaps out of balance. And this happens for everyone in every workplace in some circumstances, right? So sometimes you might have a big project coming up or a large event to plan, and for a period of time, your demands may outweigh your resources. And that doesn't seem to be problematic in the short term, but where it is problematic is when that is happening persistently over time without relief. And there's a robust body of research in organizational studies, as well as a smaller body of research in special ed that indicates when this is the case persistently over time, folks are much more likely to experience burnout. They start looking for exit doors and thinking about leaving, and they are much more likely to actually leave the profession. Now, that is of great concern because there is some older data to indicate that there are substantial inequities in special educators' demands and resources based on the proportion of students in their school who receive free and reduced priced meals. In particular, special educators who work in higher poverty schools have in the past reported that they had higher caseloads, that they had less access to administrative and collegial support, and that they had fewer material resources with which to do their work. In addition to that, there have been a lot of concerns among policymakers that there are inequities in teachers' internal resources, that more experienced teachers tend to teach in lower poverty schools, that teachers with stronger educational backgrounds tend to teach in lower poverty schools, and so on. And so in the last 20 years, we've seen a number of policies that have sought to change Inequities in teacher qualification. So you can think, for example, of the state equity plans, where states are required to monitor inequities in teacher experience and teacher qualifications across schools. You can also think of initiatives such as the Teach grants, which try to incentivize teachers to teach in higher poverty schools. But we haven't seen similar kinds of policy initiatives around working conditions, around demands and resources. So as a team, we wanted to understand how have inequities in special educators' demands and resources changed over the past 20 years in a context where there's been quite a lot of attention to inequities in qualifications and internal resources, but less attention to those school-based resources that support teachers to do their work. So we relied on the Schools and Staffing Survey and the National Teacher Principal Survey. These are nationally representative data sets that NCES administers every 4 years. We use data from the 1999 through 2015 waves. Importantly, this does not obviously include data from the pandemic. And we're really interested to see what will happen in the more recent waves when we have data on during the time of school closures. We used OLS regression to examine if school poverty status was associated with resources and demands on special educators and how that changed over time. And we did a couple of robustness checks. So we used a variety of different cut points for the proportion of students receiving free and reduced price meals. We also conducted comparisons based on the percentage of students of color in a school as another indicator of the extent to which students were marginalized within schools. So I'm going to first talk about results with regard to demands, and then I'll turn to resources. There were some demands for which we found no significant differences in any year, which was pretty encouraging. So special educators across higher and lower poverty schools didn't report any significant differences in the number of hours they worked, the number of grade levels they taught, the extent to which other duties interfered with instruction, or their caseload size, so contradicting some of that older research. Where we saw significant differences in demands was first with regard to student issues. So special educators in higher poverty schools tended to report more challenging student behavior. I want to really caution folks in how you interpret this. I do not interpret this to mean that students in higher poverty schools are behaving less appropriately. Instead, the way that I think about this is that likely those schools are providing less supports for student behavior. So for example, school-wide systems to support student behavior such as PBIS or responsive classroom or restorative justice, they all require substantial resources and sustained leadership to implement. And higher poverty schools tend to have greater leader turnover and more difficulty sustaining reforms as a result. So I think of this as indicating a problem with school-wide systems for supporting student behavior. We also saw significant differences in service delivery models, with higher poverty schools significantly more likely to, special educators in higher poverty schools significantly more likely to report that they were teaching in self-contained classes. Which indicates that students in those schools are being disproportionately served in more exclusionary settings. And this again could be related to the difficulties of sustaining reform in higher poverty schools, as inclusive school reform, like PBIS and other school reforms, requires a lot of sustained leadership and investment of resources. With regard to the resources that are provided to folks, we have some encouraging findings. So inequities in certification closed over time. So consistent with some of the older research, we did see that there were some significant disparities in the proportion of teachers who were completely uncertified in the year 2000. And that was fully closed by the year 2016. I do want to offer the caution that this refers to any certification, not to special education certification. So unfortunately, the items that asked about special education certification were inconsistent across waves, and so we couldn't look at those. But at least with regard to any certification, we did see that closing. We didn't see inequities in the extent to which folks had a special education as their primary field of study, nor did we see inequities with regard to experience in any of the waves. Where we saw significant differences, consistent with prior research, is with regard to those school-based social and logistical resources. So folks in higher poverty schools tend to report significantly weaker teacher cooperation. And in fact, that inequity got worse over time. So teachers in the 2016 wave were, the disparity between higher and lower poverty schools with regard to teacher cooperation was worse. And that's quite concerning given pretty robust evidence that when you're in a school with strong teacher cooperation, your effectiveness improves more rapidly. We also saw very consistent inequities with regards to administrative support. This was quite similar in magnitude across waves and persistent. And, it's encouraging that we're seeing administrative support kind of in general rise, but those inequities remain. And that's particularly concerning because administrative support is especially important for retention for special educators in higher poverty schools. And then finally, we saw, as with administrative support, consistent inequities in regards to access to adequate materials with pretty similar differences in magnitude over time. So some conclusions. It seems that the inequities we've primarily concerned with ourselves with as researchers and policymakers regarding experience, certification, and education, at least in these data, those seem to be closing. But inequities based on working conditions remain substantial. And so we think that policymakers should probably consider attending to inequities in working conditions, that if we're only looking at the inputs teachers are bringing with them into the classroom, we're missing the differences in the resources they're provided to use their knowledge and skill in service of students. If two students are equally likely to have a well-qualified teacher, but one of those teachers is being asked to do more work with less support, then those students may not have equitable access to the benefits of their teacher's knowledge and skill. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Liz, again, for that really important research that's really, illustrating the specific inequities that are persisting for special educators in higher poverty schools that can provide, I think, kind of in teasing apart what those inequities are, right? It makes room for some targeted policy solutions. And last, we're going to talk about one more kind of specific, teaching policy as it pertains to special education students. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Nate Jones, who is an assistant professor of special education and affiliated faculty with the Wheelock Educational Policy Center, and is a founding member of the BU Faculty of Computing and Data Sciences. In his research, Dr. Jones focuses on teacher quality, teacher development, and school improvement, with a specific emphasis on conceptualizing and measuring teaching effectiveness. So without further ado, Nate, take it away.
Thank you so much, Ariel. So I am really excited to present this paper on co-teaching on behalf of me and Marcus Winters. I will say that part of what gave rise to this paper was the paper I discussed previously today. So if folks were in the other breakout session, you heard me talk about an observation study focused on special ed teacher evaluation. And one of the things we saw in that study was a widespread use of co-teaching as a service delivery model for students with disabilities. And I would say, as somebody who has studied special education, I was also quite disheartened at what I saw and the quality of the co-teaching in those classrooms, which led Marcus and I to conduct a statewide analysis of the impact of co-teaching on kids with disabilities, as well as students without disabilities. This paper has recently been published in the Journal of Human Resources, and I'm excited to get to present it today. So why our focus on co-teaching? I think the co-teaching is intuitive and seems worthwhile for a couple of obvious reasons. So it appears to do a very nice job of achieving two parallel goals of special education. One is the promotion of inclusive education, and the second is ensuring that students have access to specialized instruction. If by bringing a special educator into a general educator's class, we can ensure that both of these goals are met, then it feels like a real win both for educators and for their students. It's also worth noting that co-teaching appears to be on the rise. So one of the things that we looked at in our data was the extent to which kids with and without disabilities were exposed to co-teaching. And since 2011 in the state of Massachusetts, at least in ELA, we've seen a steady rise in the persistence of co-teaching and the use of co-teaching as a service delivery model. But we would both argue, Marcus and I, that we have very little empirical evidence that co-teaching actually supports student learning. There are a large number of existing papers on co-teaching. Most of these describe what co-teaching should look like, how two adults should arrange themselves in classrooms, how two adults can form an effective team to support kids. but the literature on whether co-teaching actually improves outcomes for kids is quite slim. I'm including this reference to a recent handbook on special education by Cook and colleagues, where they flag this as an issue, that there is a critical need for evidence on whether co-teaching improves outcomes for students. So we decided to pursue this question. Our goal was to introduce the first causal findings of co-teaching on student achievement using statewide data on students and their teachers in Massachusetts from 2007 to 2019. So we leveraged this longitudinal data to examine what happens when kids are in co-taught classrooms and what happens when they're not in co-taught classrooms. And our approach, our methodological approach, what we do is we leverage the fact that we actually see quite a bit of movement in and out of co-taught classrooms for kids from one year to the next. So it is not the case that a kid with disabilities, for example, is exposed to co-teaching in third grade and is likely to continue in that co-taught class for the duration of their schooling. Instead, there's this kind of movement in and out. And the same is true for kids without disabilities. So we leverage this variation to try to understand the patterns for kids with and without disabilities. We compare students' performance to their own performance in years when they're in co-taught classrooms and not in co-taught classrooms. Importantly, we also distinguish between whether or not a student is in a general ed class with no co-teacher or whether they are in a special ed class with no general education teacher. So there's a number of results in the paper. I chose to include this one, which looks at disability classification and looks at, for students with specific learning disabilities, what we see in elementary and middle school. But throughout our results, we see kind of a very similar pattern, which is that on the whole, we see a small positive effect of co-teaching on students, both students with disabilities and students without disabilities. But these are very minor impacts. And so regardless of how we slice it, we see this pattern emerge again and again. So we do see statistically significant benefits of co-teaching, but it's really important to note that these are far smaller than in previous studies. So most of the studies we've seen previously have not been able to establish causal impacts of co-teaching and have looked at outcomes that are far more amenable to change, such as student grades. This is the first one that we've seen that has used student standardized test scores on a large scale. And for students with disabilities, these results are actually similar, regardless of whether we compare co-teaching to whether a kid is in a single general ed class or is in a classroom with a single special ed teacher. We also see slightly larger results when we look at middle school in comparison to elementary school. So time for some interpretation. On the one hand, these effects are encouraging. Many states formally endorse co-teaching as a service delivery model. And our results would suggest that kids are not being adversely affected by being in a co-taught classroom. But on the other hand, we see these really small effects. And it does raise some questions about trade-offs. Can we think about using special educators in more impactful ways? So if the goal of putting a special educator into a general ed classroom is to increase the likelihood that kids are exposed to specialized instruction, what we see is that it might be the case a little bit. But what if we were to use that teacher to really provide concrete instruction related to foundational skills in ways that benefit student success in the general education classroom? Just a little bit more interpretation. This is a 30,000 foot view, right? We are looking at co-teaching over several years in the population of students. Clearly, there's a need to couple results like ours with some evidence on what actually goes on in co-taught classes. As I alluded to at the beginning of this presentation, when we've observed co-taught classes, one of the common things we see is what one of my doc students referred to as special educators guarding the wall, right? Where they are really serving as a de facto classroom aide, where the general education teacher is the one who is providing instruction. And this actually really reinforces what Heather Pesky raised earlier around the egg crate organization of schooling. Co-teaching in many ways pushes back on the idea that there's a single classroom and a single teacher and a single group of students. But disrupting those norms and ensuring that two teachers are collaboratively working to support kids is much harder to see in practice. The other thing that we do not have any sort of evidence on is the cost of co-teaching. What does it look like resource-wise, personnel-wise, to reorient a school or a district around co-teaching? We know schools are doing it, we know districts are doing it, but we do not have any sort of empirical evidence that what the costs are associated with this. So overall, we see some modest positive effects, but I think we would also raise questions about the widespread support for co-teaching in research and practice as a way to solve the challenges we see facing students with disabilities in this country. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Nate, for sharing that research. It is now my pleasure to bring the discussants up to the screen to unpack it along with the other studies. So it is my pleasure to introduce both Lindsay Jones and Cynthia Paris. Lindsay Jones is the CEO of CAST, a nonprofit education research and development organization that works to transform education design and practice to make learning more inclusive. She previously served as the president and CEO of the National Center for Learning Disabilities, a nonprofit advocacy organization that promotes innovation, research, and youth voice to improve the lives of the 1 in 5 students with learning disabilities and attention issues. She also serves as the senior director for policy and advocacy at the Council for Exceptional Children, where she's led federal legislative advocacy and worked with dedicated educators from across the country. And Cynthia, so thank you, Lindsay, for joining us. And Cynthia Paris, thank you also, Cynthia, for joining us today. She joined Lawrence Public Schools as superintendent in August 2018, following her nomination by the Lawrence Alliance for Education and appointment by State Commissioner of Elementary and Secondary Education, Jeff Riley. Her career in education spans more than 20 years. Much of it is focused on working with bilingual students and turning around underperforming schools. She arrived in Lawrence from Newton Public Schools, where she was assistant superintendent of elementary education. Prior to that, she worked in Boston Public Schools for 17 years, serving as a bilingual speech-language pathologist before becoming a principal, leading her second school out of turnaround status. So to really kick the conversation off, the first question is really, in looking across these 3 papers, what is one key takeaway that stands out to you about existing policies that are shaping teaching and learning conditions that impact students with disabilities and or students classified as English learners? So Cynthia, we can start with you.
Yeah, it does highlight the need to think about our policies in a more refined way. So I think we have to think about doing some level of scrutiny, if you would, every so often with the policies and the impacts that they're having. Specifically, I was thinking about the findings about the co-teaching model, and also thinking about what is that? I was thinking that some of this work has cross implications, these policies. And so wondering also if when we think about some of the policies that affect students with disabilities and multilingual learners, can we also consider some of the other impacts that have on the pedagogy? But overall, just thinking about, we really need to examine the policies on a periodic basis.
Great, thank you. Lindsay, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Wow, thanks so much for having me. Thanks to Dean Shard, of course. Always amazing to be associated with anything he is spearheading. And I loved each of these papers, and I couldn't get enough of them. I think these, the topic couldn't be more needed in policy. I guess the key takeaway I'd say is I would love to see research in the what I liked about these papers, and what I think is hard about making a connection between policy at a federal or state level, is that so often we get evidence about an isolated intervention or an isolated policy, and yet what we really know is we need to kind of understand the multitude of factors, the combination of things happening in the school level. So, I of course, Liz's work, that team's work, looking at the many working conditions, and that's so critical. It's a gut punch, that paper, still, but just because of the stark findings that just haven't changed about the inequities in high poverty settings for many years. But also the co-teaching and the SCI endorsement, I think it's really important. The spillover effects are really interesting and important. And so I guess that was my takeaway, is like, it's so hard to, and I think in terms of disability research in general in schools and around, we focus sometimes so much on one intervention, the impact of that. And yet the classroom is such a environment of so many factors. I'd love to see sort of a combination of things coming forward. And those were the parts of these that made me think about how could policies react more to that type of multi-factor environment and finding.
Right. So what I'm hearing from both of you is really about this kind of, the cross-sectional impacts, right, of these policies. So now I'm going to ask you to actually look at them individually. Each paper does highlight, right, kind of different policy aspects of teaching conditions, right? And while these policies obviously do not occur in vacuums, I'm curious your thoughts on how you think a district or state policy could or should respond to any one of these issues, whether it's professional development, staffing assignments, or some of these on-the-job demands and resources that Liz highlighted. So Lindsay, maybe you want to start this time.
Sure, absolutely. It's hard to, it'll be really interesting to see what happens. I was very much appreciated Liz's point that special education teacher shortages have been in place for years, and we've had to deal with those for a long time. But the attrition we're seeing right now throughout schools is unprecedented, and it will impact the decisions that people make going forward. I also think it's important to state before we're getting into kind of any of these that, schools right now have a lot of money, which is not something we ever say. They still don't have enough in many ways, but the American Rescue Act funds that are out there are absolutely an infusion that should be used at the state and local level to address all of these things. And that's why these papers are so important, because that's it. It just shows you that, to make good decisions, you have to have information about this. And that said, I would say, looking at this, we must ensure right now that the impact, sort of a cross stream through all three, is teacher effectiveness and what can support teachers in these areas and what can make teacher effectiveness accelerate. It was interesting. I think Liz mentioned teacher cooperation in schools. We know that accelerates any one of these things. Co-teaching in particular, I think Nate's point about, what we often hear is that the special ed teacher is guarding the back of the wall. It's not being implemented in different ways that are about cooperation between teachers and implementation. But I do think that the policy implications have to involve making some of the relationship between special education and general education stronger in our schools. Ways to do that includes so many policy things that we could do. Co-teaching can be one of them. Staffing assignments, flexibility. It's interesting because 10 years ago, we heard paperwork was a #1 working condition issue for teachers. And that has fallen off the map in most recent studies. We saw that in Liz's, it was mentioned, but it's not lifting up. We're seeing now flexible staffing, other types of issues that we're looking at. So to me, I think the policy implications are states need this information. We need to make sure we're supporting teachers in the implementation, in their cooperation, in their ability to grow their own and provide teacher professional development in a whole bunch of different forms.
Great, thank you. And Cynthia, what about you? Especially be curious as you lead a school district, right? What you think some district policies could do to address these issues?
Yeah, I do have a few wondering. So with Nate's work, as he was saying that, co-teaching is in favor across the state, including in my own district, I was thinking, oh boy, does that mean that we should invest less? Should we re-examine? What does it mean for us specifically? Well, one thing that I thought is, on this issue that Liz was also studying in her work is the resources / demands of educators. And then I wonder what the impact of the co-teaching model is for retention on special educators and general ed educators. In my experience, our teachers are quite happy co-teaching. And so what are the benefits of that in terms of retaining and recruiting? If I'm having a hard time, and as we just mentioned, the attrition is higher given all the things that we've gone through. But when I talk and I see the teachers in the co-teaching model, they're quite happy. And I usually say, you know, this is a matchmaking process for co-teaching models. And when it works, it's a beautiful thing. And you watch kids in those classrooms, you can't even tell which is the teacher in the general ed and who is the teacher who has the specialized instruction background. But the question here is, and the wondering is, what is the effect of co-teaching on retention and even recruiting new teachers to a district or to the field? And then with the work that Marcus was highlighting in the RETELL, I wonder also, what are the implications for the teacher prep programming? And what policies can we put in place that sort of ensure that higher ed educations are offering the necessary coursework prior to the teacher leaving their degree? Because then it becomes the district's responsibility to continue to offer this PD, and teachers are quite, you know, excited to receive additional professional development. But I wonder, is it time for policymakers to look at higher ed institutions and think through what are the real qualifications that teachers need before leaving those institutions?
Great, thank you. And that almost, you know, kind of the wonderings that you have, perhaps you have more, because, you know, based on the findings shared with us today, the final question I have is, what else do you think decision makers, whether it's at the district level, state level, or federal level, what do you think they need to know about teaching conditions to optimize learning and success for English learners and for students with disabilities? So in other words, right, what are the questions that we need to be answered, you know, that we need to answer next, and why? Lindsay, would you like to go first?
Okay. Yes, I think there's so many different questions. One of them is, I really like this idea that we do need to think about our teacher pipeline, right? What can higher ed be doing, and how can the policies around that? I would personally love to see the silos between special education departments and general education departments break down in our universities. I think it starts off our teachers with the wrong frame for moving forward, doesn't reflect their classroom. I think so policy that's looking at that. Also, we've got some really great information around apprenticeships, urban teacher residencies, all types of hands-on learning and practice. Those policies can be supported, or those can be supported through policies. And I think, you know, the working conditions in schools, getting more research around that is critical, because, you know, we tried when we redid ESSA in the last go around to really make sure that information and resources were going to be tied to information about schools and what resources they actually had. It was the first time in our federal law that we did that. And we do have a lot more information now based on that. And we have to make decisions on those things. We have to make decisions that result in them. I think, honestly, you know, one of the things that I would just say at the end, which is an incredibly challenging thing for policies to do, but is something that I just feel is needed in talking to policymakers and others, and certainly must be needed with teachers everywhere. And I think I'd love to hear what Cynthia has to say about this. But I will say that we need to elevate the profession. That is at a crisis in some ways, because in trying to convince policymakers to invest and what to do, how to support, there are too many negative things out there about the profession that aren't helping us push this forward. And so, to me, what's critical is celebrating the teachers that are in schools today doing this hard work, the researchers working on this, and changing the narrative a little bit there to talk about what is working in schools, not taking away from the need to understand how things must change. But I'm a little worried, actually, at the federal level when I'm talking with policymakers about what some of their impressions are about this. It's not going to help us increase teacher attrition by any means. And or decrease teacher attrition and increase attracting teachers into the field. So I think higher ed can play a very unique role there, and policies really do shape the everyday lives of everyone. And so we have to be focused on all of it.
Yeah, actually, I couldn't agree more with elevating the profession to what it really is, which is they're like magicians, if you would, and miracle workers. Our teachers work extremely hard to meet the needs of students every single day. And we are tested with crisis and trauma after another one. And so I think policymakers should, take note of that. What are the things that they can institute to ensure that this profession remains something that is others aspire to? We have high schoolers right now that we're constantly asking them to consider to be teachers in our district. And they need to be able to feel like this is a profession that they aspire to do and that they feel like is worthy of investing in their future. And I think other questions that I might have for policymakers, again, is where are their funding sources? Specific to the funding that we have now, those are things that are infused in districts, but they are limited to things that, for example, will not support higher wages. They may not be supporting, let's say, districts who need a new building, for example. These working conditions that oftentimes you hear educators say, I'd like to stay, but my building doesn't have air conditioning. And I can't be here another summer, another late, early start of the school year when this building is so hot, for example. And districts can't be responsible solely for the infrastructure of the public education. Of course, we have to think also about things like different other conditions other than the resources of finances. But then other questions that we might have are, can we also consider, as you had mentioned, elevating the profession, but also consider what are the things that the policymakers can think of prior, and I said this earlier, to having trained our teachers and folks who really want to be in this profession. I really feel strongly about that, because then it falls on districts to consider what are the opportunities for professional development to offer our educators. And that burden should be shared. I really do believe that that should be shared. So policymakers is something to consider.
Yeah, thank you both for your responses. We have time, I think, for one or two questions. So I'll invite the presenters to come back on screen too. So the first question is for Liz. After conducting your research, what do you think special education teachers entering the workforce can prepare, learn, unlearn in order to thrive in the classroom for longer than 6 years?
Yeah, so first, I think it's not on them to do that. Like, I think it's on school leaders, it's on districts to create conditions that welcome them into schools and that support them to be effective. And I think it's not on them to change that system. At the same time, I do think we can support folks to advocate for themselves. And I hear this narrative from teachers, from school leaders, from lots of people, from community members, that like, oh, well, the good teachers sacrifice, the good teachers give it all, the good teachers don't, you can throw everything on their plates and they'll manage, they'll get by. And I think it's really toxic, because I think what that tells teachers is that if you advocate for yourself, you're not a good teacher. If you say, hey, this workload isn't reasonable, or I don't have planning time, I haven't had planning time all year, that there's something wrong with you and you're not fit for the profession. And I think that's a really toxic attitude and something we need to push back on, and we need to empower teachers to communicate when they are being asked to do too much with too few resources. I'm doing a series of focus groups with folks in self-contained settings for students with EBD right now. And we hear this from teachers where they'll say like, oh, well, I don't want to complain, or, oh, if I'm not willing to sacrifice my planning time, I'm just not, a dedicated enough teacher. And I think we need to push back on that. So.
Thank you for your response. I know there's more questions, but we are unfortunately out of time. But fortunately, we can all reconvene and continue this conversation at 11:40 for the next portion of the BU Wheelock Forum. So again, thank you so much to our presenters and our discussants on this really kind of in sharing this really research and thoughts on this kind of really important topic of teaching conditions that impact students with disabilities and English learners. And again, we hope that everyone joins us at 11:40 for the next portion of the forum.